You know, there's something about mothers that often goes unnoticed, almost like the soft ticking of a clock in the background. You don't realize it's there, keeping time for you, until one day it stops. Throughout her life, this mother, let's call her Margaret, had devoted herself so completely to her family that she forgot what it was like to exist for herself. In Pennsylvania, tucked away in a modest house that smelled of apple pie and wood polish, she spent years ironing shirts. You were simply here, and making sure dinner was warm when everyone came home. No one asked her to do it, she just did. That was love, quiet and unconditional. Margaret woke up before the sun, hands already busy with chores while the world still slept. Her son Thomas never lacked clean clothes, a packed lunch, or a birthday cake decorated with more care than any bakery could provide. And when Thomas grew older and his needs changed from scraped knees to broken hearts, she was still there, sitting at the kitchen table, pouring 2 cups of tea, waiting to listen. All those little sacrifices were stitched into the fabric of their everyday lives, almost invisible. That's the thing with mothers. They give and give, rarely expecting anything back. And often we don't see how much until it's nearly too late. Even when her own health began to slip, a little stiffness in the joints here, a slight tremor in her hands there, Margaret carried on without complaint. She would say things like, "I'm just getting older, dear, nothing to fuss about," waving away concern with that familiar gentle smile. And Thomas believed her. Maybe he wanted to. Maybe it was easier to keep seeing her as the strong, ever-capable mother who didn't need help, who would always be there. He forgot that age doesn't just show up as gray hair. It whispers into bones, slows steps, blurs vision. But Margaret never brought attention to her aches, never let on how the nights were getting longer and lonelier, how the silence of the house sometimes pressed down on her chest. It's a strange irony, how a lifetime spent putting someone else first can lead them to believe you don't need anything at all. That's exactly what happened here. Margaret had spent so many years building a home, nurturing her son's dreams and making his world gentle and warm, that by the time she needed that same tenderness, no one quite realized it. Love, when it's quiet for too long, can be mistaken for convenience. I think back to all those afternoons when Thomas would come running through the door, muddy shoes on clean floors, talking a mile a minute about his day. Margaret didn't mind the mess, she just loved that he was home, safe, happy, close. Those small moments of motherly joy were her treasures. And as Thomas grew, finding his own path, starting his own family, Margaret was content to step into the background to watch from a distance, convinced that's what good mothers do. They don't intrude, they don't burden, they just love silently. So when Thomas finally suggested that she'd be fine in the garage for the night, he probably didn't hear how those words echoed against the walls of every sacrifice she'd ever made. To him, it was temporary, a quick solution, nothing to fret over. But to Margaret, who had spent decades making sure no one ever felt cold or cast aside, it was a moment that revealed just how unseen her devotion had become. And that's the heartbreak of it, how easily we can overlook the hands that fed us, the hearts that sheltered us, until we're forced to see just how fragile that love, left unreturned, can become. Sometimes the cruelest moments in life aren't marked by shouting or anger, but by casual indifference, by words spoken lightly, without a second thought, that end up cutting the deepest. When Thomas told his mother, "Margaret, you'll be fine in the garage," he probably didn't imagine for a moment how those words might cling to her heart like frost. He might have been preoccupied, busy with phone calls, with dinner plans, with the noisy life of a man pulled in 100 different directions. Maybe in his mind it was a quick fix, a harmless arrangement for just one night, while guests filled the house. After all, it's just the garage. It's clean, it's quiet, she'll be fine. But that's the thing about these small, offhand decisions. We rarely stop to consider what they truly say. That garage wasn't part of the warm home Margaret had once built. It was a place for storing old boxes, for tools and rakes, for things that didn't quite belong in the house. And now, somehow, she too was one of those things that didn't quite belong. It wasn't malicious on Thomas's part, not outright. It was careless, it was thoughtless, but often that's all it takes to wound someone who's already quietly vulnerable. Margaret didn't argue. She didn't want to make him feel bad or seem ungrateful. That was her way, always smoothing over the rough patches so others could be comfortable. So she nodded, offered a small, understanding smile, and let him guide her gently toward the garage, as though it were just another room in the house. Inside, it smelled faintly of oil and old wood. A single lamp cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Margaret eased herself into the cot they'd set up, clutching her cardigan around her shoulders against the chill. For Thomas, it was done, a problem solved. He went back inside, back to laughter and clinking glasses, back to a warm room filled with people who probably didn't even know where his mother was sleeping that night. That's how neglect often looks, not like outright cruelty, but like simply not noticing, like forgetting to wonder how someone else feels. Meanwhile, Margaret lay there in the dim light, trying to quiet her own mind. She told herself it was fine, truly. Just one night. She replayed memories to soothe herself. Thomas's little boy giggles, the way he once used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms. How could that child grow into someone who didn't quite see her anymore? But even as she tried to comfort herself, the cold crept in through the thin blankets, a harsh reminder that she was no longer in the heart of the home she'd helped build. Maybe the saddest part is that Thomas likely never meant to be unkind. He might have even patted himself on the back for finding a solution, not realizing that he was teaching his own children something that night too. They watched their grandmother be quietly set aside, treated like an afterthought. Lessons like that don't come from lectures. They come from witnessing how we treat the most vulnerable among us. It's strange how easily love can slip into complacency. Thomas loved his mother, surely he did, but love without mindfulness, without small daily acts of respect, slowly starves. That night, with Margaret alone in the garage, was the silent culmination of years of taking her gentle presence for granted. And so, the real heartbreak was not simply the cold or the loneliness of that single night. It was the dawning realization for Margaret, and perhaps later for Thomas, that love, if left unguarded, can quietly turn into neglect. As night settled deeper over the little Pennsylvania town, a heavy quiet fell over the garage. Margaret lay on the narrow cot, trying to find comfort on the thin mattress that seemed to press against her old bones. Every so often she shifted, hoping for a softer spot that never appeared. A single bulb glowed weakly overhead, its hum the only companion in the silence. Outside the small window, the moon shone brightly, almost sympathetically, as if it, too, were watching this moment unfold. Inside the house, muffled laughter drifted through the walls. The sounds of plates clinking and voices rising in cheerful conversation felt painfully distant. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine she was simply in another room, that soon Thomas would come tap lightly at the door and say, "Mom, come inside, we've saved you a slice of cake." But the knock never came. The minutes stretched into hours. Her hands folded on her chest grew colder, and despite her best efforts to think of warm summer afternoons or the sweet smell of her garden, she felt a loneliness settle over her that she hadn't known in all her years of living. Then, sometime after midnight, it happened small at first, just a tiny tightness in her chest. Margaret took a breath, slow and careful, willing it away. Perhaps it was only nerves. Perhaps it was just the chill. But the feeling didn't pass. Instead it deepened, blooming into something sharper, a heavy ache that began to radiate down her arm. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time in her long life, she felt real fear that she might not see the morning. She tried to sit up, hoping movement would ease it, but her body seemed strangely heavy, uncooperative. A faint dizziness rolled through her, and for a moment she clutched the edge of the cot to keep from slipping off. Her mind went immediately to Thomas, and 100 memories crowded in at once. Him as a boy, running down the hallway with arms outstretched, the way he used to lean against her side when he was sleepy, how proud she'd been at his graduation, tears blurring her view as he accepted his diploma. These weren't just memories, they were little pieces of her heart. And in that moment, lying alone in the dim, cold garage, she realized how desperately she wished he could see her now, not as a burden or a sideline fixture, but as the same mother who once cradled his entire world. Somewhere in the house she heard laughter again, bright and careless. It seemed impossibly far away. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not so much for herself, but for Thomas, that he would someday understand what this night meant, what it revealed, that he would remember how fragile life is, how quickly a mother's steady presence can slip into memory. Eventually the pain eased, not entirely, but enough for her breathing to settle. She lay there quietly, tears drying on her cheeks, feeling the weight of all the years she'd lived. It wasn't just her heart that ached. It was the sudden realization that love could be so easily misplaced, overlooked, tucked away in garages while life carried on without it. Hours later, as dawn broke and light began filtering through the small window, Margaret felt something shift inside her. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that this night had changed something fundamental, not only between her and Thomas, but within her own sense of what she deserved, of what any person who's given their life to love and care should rightfully expect in return. Sometimes it takes the hush of a long, painful night to show us exactly where we stand in the hearts of those we hold most dear. In the soft grey of early morning, Margaret finally sat up, her body stiff and her heart carrying the bruises of the night before. The worst of the pain in her chest had passed, but something else had settled there, a tender, almost sorrowful understanding of how easily the bonds that tie us together can fray when we stop tending to them. It's one thing to say we love someone, to send a birthday card or make a polite phone call now and then. It's quite another to show it through presence, respect, and care, especially when the person needing it most becomes less convenient, more fragile. Margaret had spent her entire life believing that family meant everything, that there was a sacred promise woven through blood, a promise to stand by each other, to keep one another close, no matter how old or frail any of them became. She'd carried that belief through every stage of her life. From the days she rocked Thomas to sleep to the afternoons, she quietly folded his laundry long after he was capable of doing it himself. Even when he grew up, moved away, and started a family of his own, she trusted in the invisible thread connecting them, confident it could never snap. But lying alone in the garage had forced her to see things differently. It's not that Thomas didn't love her. She truly believed he did. It was that love, when taken for granted, can become a kind of habit rather than an act of the heart. In his mind, perhaps he had done enough simply by opening his home to her, by giving her a place under his roof. But there's a world of difference between sharing a house and sharing your life. And it had taken one long, aching night for Margaret to see how far apart those two things truly were. What's hardest is recognizing that sometimes it's the very people we treasure most who fail us in the deepest ways, not through dramatic betrayals, but through small, careless decisions that reveal a subtle erosion of respect. That was the truth Margaret woke up to as the first rays of sunlight touched the concrete floor. Her son, the boy who once clung to her hand crossing busy streets, who scribbled crayon hearts that said, "I love you, Mommy," had somehow lost sight of who she still was. Not just an old woman who needed a bed for the night, but his mother, the very reason he'd ever known what love and safety felt like. Margaret thought about how easy it is for any of us to slip into that kind of blindness. Life moves quickly, responsibilities pile up, and before we know it, the people who once meant everything become part of the backdrop, familiar, expected, overlooked. It's not always intentional. Most of the time, it's just the slow drift of priorities, the comfortable assumption that those who have always been there always will be. But standing there in the chill of that garage, Margaret understood something important. Love must be tended like a delicate garden. It needs daily acts of care, moments of presence, words that honor not just the memory of what someone once did for you, but the truth of who they still are. Because without that, even the strongest bonds can quietly loosen until, one day, they're little more than ghost threads that fail to hold when life pulls hard. By the time Margaret stepped back into the house, she was different, not just in how she felt about Thomas, but in how she saw the nature of family itself. It wasn't an unbreakable guarantee written in shared blood. It was a living promise, renewed each day by how we choose to see and care for one another. And sometimes, the deepest heartbreak is learning that not everyone will rise to keep that promise. Margaret didn't say much the next morning. She sat quietly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea more for comfort than warmth. Thomas moved around the kitchen in a rush, offering polite smiles and half-distracted comments about his day ahead, unaware that something had subtly shifted in the space between them. It's strange how a single night can become a dividing line, drawing a clear before and after in a way that words never quite manage. For so long, Margaret's entire sense of worth had been tied to the people she loved. It was stitched into every meal she cooked, every sock she mended, every late night she stayed up waiting for Thomas to come home safely. That was what being a mother meant to her, pouring herself so fully into someone else that she scarcely noticed when her own cup ran dry. It never occurred to her that one day she might need to stand up and advocate for her own dignity, to remind even her own son that love demands more than simply assuming someone will always be there. But that morning, stirring her tea with small, careful motions, Margaret felt something inside her solidify. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like a gentle awakening, a quiet understanding that she was still more than someone's aging mother to be set aside when inconvenient. She had spent decades being the heart of a home, the keeper of stories, the steady hands that soothed fevers and fears. Those things didn't simply vanish because her hair had turned silver and her steps had grown slower. It was time, she realized, to start honoring that truth herself, even if Thomas did not. Perhaps especially because he did not. It takes a special kind of strength to hold compassion in one hand and self-respect in the other. Margaret knew she didn't want bitterness to take root in her heart. She still loved Thomas deeply. Nothing could undo the years of tender moments they'd shared. But love, she understood now, wasn't meant to strip her of her voice or her right to be treated with care. So later that afternoon, when Thomas asked offhandedly if she might help tidy up the guest room again for visitors, Margaret paused. She looked at him fully, really looked past the hurried adult who barely met her eyes, back to the little boy who once clutched her hand in grocery stores. And then, with surprising calm, she said, "Not today, dear. I think I'll take a little time for myself." It was such a small sentence, but it landed with quiet weight. Thomas blinked, caught off guard, perhaps seeing for the first time in many years that his mother wasn't just a convenient fixture in his busy life, always ready to serve. She was a person who had given generously of her love and time, and who now, at last, was learning to give a small portion of that back to herself. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch wrapped in a soft shawl, breathing in the cool air. The sun dipped low over the Pennsylvania fields, painting everything in hues of gold. She felt a tender ache for all the years gone by, but also a gentle pride, because it's no small thing to reach a point in life where you can stand in the full light of who you are, quiet, weathered but undeniably whole, and say without bitterness or regret, I am still here and I still matter. As the days went on, something remarkable began to unfold within Margaret, a kind of quiet renewal. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't look like the sweeping changes you hear about in inspirational stories. It was simply a tender, daily choice to see her own life as valuable, to remember that her years of care and devotion were not things to be brushed aside or packed into the shadows of a garage. They were living proof of a heart that had always loved first and asked for so little in return. But Margaret also came to understand that while it's a beautiful thing to love deeply, it's equally important to be loved back in ways that honor who you are. That's what real family is meant to do, not just celebrate your youth and your giving seasons, but to stand by you when you're older, when your hands tremble and your steps slow. It's in those moments when you are most vulnerable that the true measure of your relationships is revealed. She thought often about Thomas, and her hope for him never wavered. Even after everything, she didn't wish him guilt or sorrow. What she quietly wished was that he would learn before it was too late, that he'd come to see how fleeting these chances are to show care, to stand by someone who once stood so unwaveringly by him. Because one day he might find himself on the other side of things, hoping for the same gentle mercies he once so easily overlooked. Margaret's story, in the end, is not just about a mother and son in a small Pennsylvania town. It's about all of us. It's about how easy it is to fall into the rush of our own lives, to forget the people who once centered their entire world around us. It's about how casually we might say, she'll be fine, or he knows I love him, without stopping to show it in ways that truly matter. We live in a time when distance is often measured in more than just miles. It's measured in distractions, in the clutter of our busy days, in the way we allow small inconveniences to overshadow priceless chance to be there for the people who made us who we are. And the saddest part is that by the time we realize we should have paid closer attention, sometimes the opportunity is already slipping through our fingers. So perhaps Margaret's night in the garage serves a purpose beyond her own pain. Maybe it's meant to reach each of us, to gently shake us awake to the truth that the way we care for our elders, our parents, our grandparents, those quiet souls who loved us into being, says more about who we are than any polished words ever could. It's a reminder that respect and tenderness are not grand gestures performed once a year, but small, daily acts that stitch the fabric of our families together. And in the end, long after Margaret's story is done being told, long after the teacups are washed and the porch grows cold in the evening breeze, the simplest truth remains: the hearts that held us first deserve to be held just as carefully in return.